Shalom, everyone. This is Achihud, and this is the last set in the series that we're going to be doing. And this whole thing came about in response to the pandemic. We were all locked down, and I want to thank all the rabbis that have showed up and gave us wonderful shiurs. And thank God things seem to be going back to normal. And hopefully they do go back to normal and they stay normal. And the yeshivas, they all open up completely, and we can all get some good Torah learning in. Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim, for giving us the shiurs that you've gave us. We really appreciate it. You can go ahead and take it away.
Very well. Thank you, Achihud, and shalom to all those who are with us live and all those who will be viewing the recording eventually. Chag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom soon, tomorrow, to everybody. What I would like to address today, before I continue, is everyone able to hear me and see me properly?
Yes.
Okay, very good. What I would like to address today is the question of Korban Pesach, the sacrificial sacrifice. I meant to say the Paschal or Pesach sacrifice that we are commanded in the Torah to bring on Yod Daled Ben Nisan, the 14th day of Nisan, that is to say the afternoon before Leil Seder, and to talk about why we do not have one today, and is that how it is supposed to be? In other words, according to the Torah, are we required to do so? Is it possible to do so? And if so, if it is possible, why are we not doing it? This question, of course, is part of a much larger, broader question having to do with concepts like Yemot HaMashiach, the Messianic age. Is there a connection between that concept and what we just mentioned now, Korban Pesach? We will address some of these things briefly. I will begin with a story, a true story. Many, many years ago, I was invited to give a shiur to a program, a group of young yeshiva boys from the United States in a yeshiva called Yeshivat Sha'alabim here in Israel. It was a program that came for a couple of months towards the end of the winter. And they had with them a certain rabbi from their school, the yeshiva high school. These students were about 17 years old, and they came to Israel for a couple of months, and I was asked to give them a shiur. And I began to discuss this very topic about Korban Pesach. Excuse me. And I began to tell them that what I'm about to tell you now, that there is absolutely no valid, cogent Torah reason why we do not have a Korban Pesach today. And the only reason we do not have one, or actually there are two reasons. One reason is that the vast majority of the Jewish people either don't care, or those who might care, were they to know more, are under the impression that we are unable to do so. And the other reason is the political realities on the ground. And that is, every year now, for quite some years in Israel, the Israeli police force has physically prevented Jews who actually wanted to go onto Har HaBayit with a lamb to perform a Korban Pesach. And if this sounds strange to you, some of you may not be aware of this fact, but it's true. Such a thing was reported in the Israeli media just a few days ago, before the beginning of Pesach, that police raided a couple of homes in the old city of Yerushalayim, where they found a couple of lambs that were being kept there so they could be brought on Erev Pesach, on Shabbat, in the hope apparently of trying to perform a Korban. I of course understand, as you probably understand, that there was no real chance of this happening. But the problem is not an halachic one. It is not a Torah problem or issue. The issue is entirely politics and a decision on the part of the Israeli authorities, which I condemn, not to allow Jews to perform this essential mitzvah. Excuse me. So I began speaking about this to this group of students. And I mentioned that this is a chovah, this is an obligation, explicitly written in the Torah. The mitzvah of bringing the Korban Pesach, participating in a group of Jews who bring such a Korban, is one of only two mitzvot aseh, positive commandments in the Torah, for which, if one is able to do so and refrains from doing so, one is hayav kareth. The only other example of a mitzvah aseh, where if one does not do it, one does not perform that mitzvah, one is hayav kareth, is brit milah, is circumcision. A Jew who, for whatever reason, when he was a child, was not circumcised, and becomes aware of this when he's older and does not do anything about it, he is hayav kareth for not circumcising himself, for not arranging for it. And the same is true for the Korban Pesach. And the rabbi, the instructor, and the person who had accompanied them from the United States here to Israel at that time, this is going back about probably 30 odd years. This rabbi began to protest as I was speaking to this group of students, and said, "That's not right. That cannot be. That's not what the Gdolim or the Gdolim or the great rabbis say." And I said to him, "I'm afraid that you're mistaken. This is exactly what the great rabbis say." He refused to accept what I was saying. So I said to him, "Well, let me start quoting to you from it." And I had prepared a source sheet, as I have now for this year also. I had prepared a source sheet, and I said, "Well, let us look together at this teshuvah, this halachic response written by Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Hatam Sofer, one of the greatest of the Aharonim, universally recognized as such, which he wrote over 200 years ago to his father-in-law, who was only a year and a half older than himself, because the Hatam Sofer, when his first wife passed away, married a daughter who was much younger than himself, a daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eger. Hagon Rabbi Akiva Eger these two Hachamim were universally recognized in that generation, in Europe and around the world, as the greatest of the time. And any person familiar with Torah, any person who has studied Torah for any length of time in a serious manner will be aware of these facts. So I said to this rabbi, "Look, let us look together at this teshuvah written by the Hatam Sofer to Rabbi Akiva Eger on this very subject, and you will see what he says, and then you'll tell me if what I'm saying is correct, if in fact this is what the greatest Rabbanim say or not." And he agreed to going through this teshuvah with the students and with him present in the room, and we did so. And I'll tell you about what happened later, what he said in response to what we're about to read here in the Hatam Sofer. So this teshuvah appears in the Teshuvot, Shuth Hatam Sofer in Yura De'ah, Siman Resh Lamed Waw, 236. Anyone who wishes to check and see this text for himself is welcome to do so. Look up, go to Shuth Hatam Sofer, Halak Yura De'ah, Siman Resh Lamed Waw, and it's right there, and you can read it. It's printed on the page. It's on every. It can be found in every copy, every edition of these halachic response of the Hatam Sofer. I have quoted that text precisely as it appears, and it's on the page before you, which I think and hope that you can see. And let us read together what it says here. So this question was asked actually well over 200 years ago by Rabbi Akiva Eiger. He asked his son-in-law, technically, he was only a year and a half younger than him, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Hatam Sofer. He asked him, what is his opinion about the following? And you will see in the second paragraph, he writes as follows. The question was as follows. Levakesh misarei Yerushalayim iten reshut lahakriv. In other words, we're talking about the Ottoman period, well over 200 years ago. Those who ruled over Eretz Yisrael at that time were the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. And in the Jewish world at that time, for various reasons, this discussion had somehow reached a certain level of prominence, and it was something that was being discussed in parts of the Jewish world, to the extent that Rabbi Akiva Eiger thought this was a very serious question. And the question goes like this: if the Turkish Sultan, the leader of the Ottoman Empire, were to give his permission that the Jews, those who wish to, at least, who wish to bring a Korban Pesach, would be allowed to do so on Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, would it be possible? Would we be required to do so? Would it be possible to do so halachically? In other words, the question was theoretical. If this Turkish Sultan were to be agreeable, would we, the Jews, from a Torah perspective, be able and required to do so? That was the question. It never came to this because the Turkish Sultan never gave his permission for such a thing. But that was the question that was being discussed here. So I'll read with you some lines of this teshuvah, which you have before you. Second paragraph. Ikrat kodsho higiani. I skipped certain things. He's writing, as we said, to his colleague and also his father-in-law, Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Levakesh misarei Yerushalayim iten reshut lahakriv. Is it possible to ask permission of the rulers of Yerushalayim, the Ottomans, to permit a Korban Pesach? Hu kapdan gadol ki yahu amar leval yikrav sham mi she'eno me'emunat Yishmael, and it is known that their policy is not to allow any non-Muslim to approach Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. Ki sham nivna beit avodah shelahem, because they have a house of worship there, as we know. And it is said that the rock known as Even HaShetiyah, which was the Kodesh HaKodashim in the mikdash, in the temple, is to be found to this day. That same rock is under the dome, under the golden dome, which in fact it is. In other words, there is definitely a rock there. One can see the photographs. And they do not allow foreign people, that is to say non-Muslims, to approach. All right, but assuming that this was not the issue, assuming that the Turks were to allow it, the question was, I read now the third paragraph, there are three halachic points that Rabbi Akiva Eiger raised with the Hatam Sofer regarding the possibility or any possible halachic impediments to performing the Korban Pesach. And what were these issues? One was tum'ah. In other words, Jews today are not tahor in terms of tumat met, in terms of the tumah that applies to a Jew who has come into contact with the dead. That's number one. Number two, yehilsek kahuna, which means, are we certain that those that we recognize today as kohanim are in fact kohanim? Are they reliably kohanim or not? Because according to Hazal, there are certain genealogical proofs required going back a few generations to prove. A Kohen who wishes to work in the mikdash has to be able to show that his ancestors from recent generations were definitely of kosher stock, and he's definitely a Kohen. For example, in which case might he not be a Kohen if his father, shall we say, or his grandfather, shall we say, married a woman who was a Kohen, married a woman that he was not allowed to marry according to the Torah. Let's say, for example, a divorced woman, then his son, the son of that Kohen from that woman, is called a halal, and he's not a Kohen. He cannot function as a Kohen in the mikdash or for any purpose really. So, do we require this kind of level of proof with regards to Kohanim? Because we don't have these genealogical tables or this information today. Once upon a time, people kept these records in the family, and they knew they had family trees, and they could show clearly and without doubt their lineage. That was the second point. Number two. Number three was Avnei Hoshen. In other words, do we require a Kohen Gadol? And one of the requirements of the Kohen Gadol is to wear the Hoshen, the breastplate, which has on it various precious stones. Do we in fact know the identification of those precious stones? And if we don't, is all of this ma'akev? In other words, does these things prevent us from performing a Korban Pesach? Yes or no? The Hadam Sofer begins to respond to these points, and he writes, הנה בספר כפתור ופרח פרק שלישי, שם כתב שרבנו יחיאל מפריז, רבנו יחיאל מפריז was, it should say רבנו יחיאל מפריז, even though it says, there's a slight mistake here, but he's referring to Rabbeinu Yehiel Paris, who was one of the Balei Tosafot, the greatest of his generation. At the time, the same generation as the Rambam. And he and the Ramban both came to Eretz Yisrael, and one of the things they did want to do was to bring the Korban Pesach. So he quotes this from a sefer, from a book called Kaftor Waferah, which is a book written by one of the Rishonim, a very important sefer which deals with many subjects which pertain to Eretz Yisrael and the Mikdash. So he says that Rabbeinu Yehiel Paris Ala Yerushalayim Shnat Yod Zayin Le'elef HaShishi, that is the 17th year of the 6th millennium, that is to say the year 1257, according to the Christian calendar. Wa'amar la'arav sherotze la'akriv korbanot. In other words, there was the intention on the part of a number of great rabbis who came to Eretz Yisrael at that time. We're talking about 770 plus years ago, nearly 800 years ago. They wanted to perform korbanot. Were it possible? If they were able to obtain permission? In other words, the author of the Kaftor Waferach says, I forgot to ask some of these points. And then he went on to say, Shuv katar halot tuma hutra b'sibur. That's point number one. There is a halachic principle which is stated explicitly in the Talmud and appears in the Rambam, and there is no argument about this. No halachic authority disagrees with this fact. That this halachic principle states, Tuma dehuya b'sibur, which means if the halakha states that a person who is tameh meth, who came into contact with the dead and has not been purified by means of the water and the ashes of a para aduma, a red heifer, that person cannot participate in the Korban Pesach. It follows, you might think, that all of us, therefore, are in that position today, and therefore we cannot have a Korban Pesach. That happens to be mistaken. That is not true. Why not? Because the halakha is that when all or most of Am Yisrael is in that position, and it is impossible to purify everyone before Pesach, then we are to go ahead and perform the Korban Pesach, betuma, as we are, without being metuhar, without being purified with the paraduma. And that is the halakha, and there is no mahlokat about this. So if all or most of Am Yisrael are in that state, the Korban Pesach is to be brought anyhow, even in that state of tum'ah, and it is also eaten b'tum'ah. It's not that we bring it, but we don't eat from it. No, it is brought and it is eaten from. That is number one. The next point, Umikohem yuhas lo izkir klal. This is the Hatham Sofer writing, the Kaftor Waferach, when writing about this topic, do not even go into the question of Kohen yuhas. And then he goes on to say, Uvi Abes, Halik ala Siman Peter, this is referring to the famous Abes, the son of the Hacham Tzavi, one of the greatest of the Aharonim, a generation or two before this time, before the time of the Hatham Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eger. Hevi mimenu beqisur b'chatav alo sheyesh lish'ol gam al shiklei tzibur. Is there a requirement for the Mahasit HaSheker? Ulai Korban Pesach, Ratzah L'Akriv, Davar B'tum'ah V'Sibur, as we just mentioned. V'lo ba'esh shekalim. So the Abetz also addressed this question and said that perhaps it was when referring to Korbanot, if we're talking about Korbanot of the Sibur, that is to say, Korbanot that are brought on a daily basis, B'Shem Kol Yisrael, for all of Am Yisrael, in the name of Am Yisrael, for that you require Mahasit HaSheker. In other words, every Jew around the world is required to give a Mahasit HaSheker, send it to the mikdash, and all requirements for the Korbanot are purchased from that fund, from that money that is donated by every Jew, so that every Jew has a portion in all the Korbanot of the Sibur, all the public Korbanot of Am Yisrael. And we don't have that at the present time, although would not be a very difficult thing to organize. But the Abed says probably what Rabbeinu Yehiel Paris and the Rambam and others were talking about was a Korban Pesach, which does not require shekalim, does not require Mahasit HaShekel at all. And as we mentioned, the Korban Pesach is also brought even in the state of Tum'ah, when that is the reality of most of Am Yisrael. When it comes to the vestments, the garments worn by a Kohen, this was not even raised by these poskim. It is not necessary. It is not an absolute requirement to have a Kohen Gadol in order to have a Korban Pesach. We can make a Korban without him, without a Korban, without a Kohen Gadol, without a high priest. נראה דלקה שעמידי לרבנו יחיאל ז"ל. דמן למעלה דלא יקריב החזקה. When it comes to the question of the lineage of the Kohanim, the halacha is, as explained here by the Hatham Sofer and also by the Abes and others, that when you have Kohanim whose lineage is not verifiable, and you have others whose lineage is absolutely verifiable, in other words, the Kohanim whose lineage is verifiable are called Kohanim Miyuhasim, and those who are not are called Kohanim She'enam Miyuhasim, that we cannot state for a fact that we know who their ancestors were going back a number of generations. Then you opt for those Kohanim who are Miyuhasim, definitely. But when there are no Kohanim Miyuhasim available, for that reason, you do not hold up, you do not refrain from performing Korban Pesach. That's what it states here. There are certain other halachic details that the Hatam Sofer goes into here to further support his basic response, which is that none of these halachic issues are really insurmountable problems, not at all. And if we were to receive that permission from the Ottoman authorities at that time, well over 200 years ago, then yes, we would go ahead. But he mentions a few other points here, but I move on to the next paragraph, which is the bottom of page 1 of this 2-page document, which I think you can see. Al-Ken, lefi aniyut da'ati, writes the Hatam Sofer, it is my opinion. Lo sarichim lekohen miyuhas. We do not require kohanim miyuhasim with special lineage. V'nochal shamina pesachim, al kol panim shehutar tumah b'tzibur, b'erev pesach. And it is mutar, and therefore, if it's mutar, we're also therefore obligated to do so. The miswah didn't go on holiday. Miswah do not go on vacation. Miswah are there for all time. If you are able to perform a miswah which is incumbent upon you, or if Am Yisrael is able to do so, then Am Yisrael is required to do so. When there is ones, the word ones means you are physically prevented from doing something, as the current police force in this country prevents Jews from performing this mitzvah. That is honest. That is something beyond our control, unfortunately. But when that is not the case, the mitzvah always applies. It's just a question of whether you are able to perform the mitzvah which applies, or you're unable at this point to do so. The same is true, for example, of a Jew who was, shall we say, living in cold, wintry, snowbound Russia generations ago, and one was unable to procure arbat haminim, lulav, and etrog on Sukkot. Sometimes Jews in these places, in various communities, ordered arbat haminim many months in advance, hoping to receive it before Pesach. Hoping to receive it before Sukkot, but it did not arrive in time. It happened frequently that the arbat haminim did arrive, but after Sukkot, for which reason there is in Yiddish an expression when referring to something that arrives too late and is no longer of any value, is no longer helpful at all. In Yiddish we say, "Das ist Welt, wie es leigem nach Sukkot." This thing is worth as much as an etrog that arrives after Sukkot. In other words, it has no value at all. That was not infrequently the case in various parts of the Galuth, because arbat haminim were not readily available. So a Jew who lived in such a place, who had ordered and paid for probably for these arbat haminim, but did not receive them in time, we do not say that the miswah of lulav or etrog does not apply to him, or from his perspective, there's no such miswah. No, we say correctly, there is such a miswah. It applies to all people of all times, all Jews at all times. But he was prevented, for reasons of honest, he was prevented from doing this miswah, performing this miswah. But the miswah stands, and the same is true of Korban Pesach. And that is what the Hatam Sofer responds to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. He says, I read it again, Al Kol Panim, the beginning of this paragraph, על כל פנים, לפי עניות דעתי, לא צריכים לכהן מיוחס, ונאכל שמן הפסחים, על כל פנים, שהותר טומאה בציבור, ולא צריך לשקלים, ולא לכהן גדול. So all these points that you have mentioned, he says to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, Kohen Gadol, do we need a Kohen Gadol? Do we need the Avnei HaHoshen, the stones for the breastplate? Do we require shekalim, mahasita shekel? No, the answer is no. We don't absolutely require any of these things. All these things are good and wonderful if we can achieve them. But in order to perform a Korban Pesach, none of these things are ma'akev. These things do not prevent us from performing the mitzvah. That is the teshuvah of, in brief, that is the teshuvah of the Hatam Sofer to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. When I went through this teshuvah briefly, as I have done now with you, when I gave this shiur to this group of students those many years ago, again, the Rav who had come with them from the States, who was accompanying them and in charge of them, he began jumping up and down, and he was very agitated. And he said that cannot be true. That teshuvah that you're quoting must be either a forgery or a mistake. And I looked at him. I was quite surprised and almost shocked to hear this. And I said, "What do you mean? How could you possibly imagine there's some mistake or there's a forgery? This is printed." And I showed it to him. I had the book. I said, "Here it is. It's printed in Hatam Sofer. It's right before you. Here it is. Look at it for yourself." And he says, "Well, that cannot be true," because he said, "I know many Jews in America who follow the customs and the practices and the halachic opinions of the Hatam Sofer, and not one of them ever said such a thing to me." This was his proof, which of course is no proof at all of anything. More than likely, these individuals to whom he refers had never seen this teshuvah of the Hatam Sofer. It's not as if everybody is familiar with every teshuvah that the Hatam Sofer wrote, and he wrote thousands. At any rate, the point of relating this story to you is that, first of all, you should know there is such a teshuvah, and I have never seen any halachic authority speak about, refer to this teshuvah of the Hatam Sofer and disagree with it. I am unaware of such a thing. Nor do I believe there is any Rav in this generation, or for a number of generations prior to our time, who would claim to be on a level to be able to disagree with the Hatam Sofer or with Rabbi Akiva Eiger, both of whom are considered amongst the greatest Rabbanim of the last several centuries. We are not aware that Rabbi Akiva Eiger disagreed with the Hatam Sofer, that he wrote this question to his colleague and his son-in-law, whom he respected very greatly. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was a very great Ano. He was very, very humble and unassuming, and he himself could have answered the question, but he was obviously also asked by people, "What do you say about this?" He wanted to hear what the Hatam Sofer had to say, which is unsurprising for those of us who know about the character, the midoth of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. One would almost expect him to do so. But he himself was someone who knew the entire Torah and could have written the same response. But he wanted to hear what another great Torah scholar had to say. And this is what the Hatam Sofer said. So I repeat, I don't think there's anybody who disagrees or could possibly disagree with what it says here. And for the record, I brought here on the second page the quote from the Sefer Kartova Perek Well, the 6th chapter, which is the source that was quoted by the Hatam Sofer. Those who want to see the original, what the Kartova Perek actually wrote, are welcome to go ahead and do so. It's written here before you. And we'll read a few lines. It says as follows: "Mahal she'ha'inyan ken, hanichnas hayom she'anu tme'im b'makom habayit hayav karet." In other words, a person who enters the restricted areas of Har HaBayit, because there are areas on Har HaBayit where a Tameh may enter, and there are areas where he may not. So it's a question of knowing where those demarcation lines are. גם כי אמר אלי בירושלים כשהבאתי אליו זה הספר עבור עליו, שרבנו יחיה מפריז אמר לבוא לירושלים, והוא בשנת 17 לאלף השישי, ושיקריב קורבנות בזמן הזה. So he's relating how a certain great Rav said to him that he knew that Rabbeinu Yehiel Paris, who was a long time before the author of this book, the Kartov Afera. And then he speaks about these very points here. And he relates how he realized as soon as these issues were raised, the questions that we mentioned about the Kohen Yuhas, the Kohen with a definite provable lineage, and questions to do with Tum'ah, when Am Yisrael is Tameh, as we are today. Unfortunately, again, Para Aduma is not something that is beyond our capability. It is something we could do if we wanted to do it. I'm not going to read all of this with you now. The document is here. Anyone who wishes to see it, or if they wish me to send it to them, I'm happy to do so. The bottom line that one needs to internalize from these discussions is the following. The mitzvot of the Torah were never placed on hold. There is no such thing as placing the Torah or part of the Torah on hold. All of the Torah, all Tariyav mitzvot, all 613 mitzvot apply at all times. The question is Am Yisrael always able or interested and willing in performing the mitzvah? Clearly, at a time when there were no or very few Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, many mitzvot, such as Korban Pesach, were not feasible. It was not possible to do so. But when that reality changes, the halachic reality is also changed. In other words, that which was previously impossible for reasons of honest, being prevented from doing so by others who control your life and do not allow you to do Hashem's bidding. When that reality changes, the halachic reality changes. The fact now is now you can do it, and you're able, and therefore also required to do so. And this is a fundamental understanding that all Jews need to recognize. There is no miswah in the Torah to wait for the Mashiach, for example. There's no such miswah. And in fact, there's nothing to wait for. Because, and now we'll say something that will possibly be misunderstood by some people, but before I even say it, I wish everyone to be patient and listen and wait for the explanation of what I'm saying, and why I say this. There's nothing to wait for because the Mashiach is not coming. What I mean by that is, the Mashiach is not something that comes by itself. It's not something that you wait for, and you just wait patiently long enough, and eventually it happens, and there you have the Mashiach arrives, and then everything just falls into place in some kind of magical, supernatural way. There are people who understand the concepts of Yemot HaMashiach and the building of the mikdash, and they also included in this discussion something like the Korban Pesach, which does not require the mikdash, by the way. The only thing required to have a Korban Pesach is to have a mizbeach, to have the altar. The rest of the mikdash is necessary, but not for Korban Pesach. One can manage without the rest of the mikdash. In other words, if one could erect just the mizbeach, one is able to perform all the essential korbanot. Yes, there is a mitzvah to build the whole mikdash, the entire complex of the temple, of the mikdash, but that is a huge project, and that would take years. If it takes, on average, 2 years plus in Israel today to build a 4-story apartment block, then I guarantee it will take a long time, much more than that, to build an entire mikdash. But to build a mizbeach is something that you could achieve in a few days. And this is also a well-known halachic principle. It appears in the Mishnah at the end of Masechet Eduyot. Rabbi Yoshua there states as follows: Shamati shemakrivim af al pi she'en bayit. I received the tradition, the halachic tradition from the prophets, the latter-day prophets, that it is possible to bring korbanot even when the mikdash does not stand. That is to say, if you are able to build the mizbeach on the right spot, on Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, even if the rest of the mikdash is not standing at this point, you may bring, and one therefore, if you may, you're also required to bring the korbanot. This halacha is brought by the Rambam. Again, it's not something that is really up for debate. No halachic authority could claim that it is not so. It's explicit in the Mishnah, it's explicit in the Talmud, it's explicit in the Rambam. It's wherever you look, you will find it. That is the halacha. Makrivim af al pi she'en bayit. So those who think, and there are many Jews who think this, and they are mistaken, those who think that the mikdash cannot be built until this hoped for Mashiach appears from somewhere, falls out of the heavens on a white donkey or some such childish notion. Those who think such things are misled, are misguided. It is not so. This is not true. The Mashiach, the times of the Mashiach come about when the Jewish people decide they want them to come about. In other words, when the Jewish people want to establish a state based on the Torah and the Torah's principles and precepts, then such a state will come into being. When the Jewish people wish to have a mikdash, there will be one. When the government of the Jewish people wants there to be such a thing and is agreeable to such a thing, it will happen. But as it says in Masechet Bava Batra, the Talmud Bavli, Daf Daled, without the government wishing and agreeing to such a thing, you cannot build a mikdash. You cannot go ahead and build a mikdash if the government is opposed to such a project, which today, unfortunately, it is. But it has nothing to do with the Mashiach appearing miraculously from somewhere. That's not how the Torah works. This is a complete misunderstanding of the Torah. And to explain this point further, without spending too much time on it, but I wish to share another screen with you. I wish to open up something in the Rambam. Which we will read together and explain briefly. I hope that you're able now to see a screen. Ilchot Malachim Milhamot Perek Yud Aleph. This is at the very end of Rambam's Mishneh Torah. Is everyone able to see it? Is everyone able to see the screen with the Rambam, the text of the Rambam?
Yes, Rabbi, we can see him here.
Very good. So, Perek Yud Aleph, Ilchot Malachim Milhamot, Halacha Heth. Rambam writes in Halacha Zayin. I mark it out here in blue, as you can see. One should read all of this chapter, but we cannot do that now, so I recommend to all of you to do so later. Rambam here says briefly, this is the bottom line, says Rambam. The Torah that we receive from Hashem, the mitzvot and the rules of the Torah do not change. Ever. We do not add to them, nor do we detract from. וכל המוסיף או גורע או שגילה פנים בתורה והוציא הדברים של המסווף מפשוטן. Anyone who suggests that some facets of the Torah, some miswaf of the Torah should not be taken literally, do not have to be performed in practice in reality, in the real world, or they suggest that they applied once but not today. Such a person, such a person is to be treated as an evil and disbelieving individual. Rambam continues then, Halacha Heth, I mark it out in blue again. Im Ya'amod Melech mi Beth David, if a leader of the Jewish people, referred to here as a king, but the title does not matter. If a leader of the Jewish people, a descendant of David HaMelech, and by the way, that's also not absolutely essential, as the Rambam himself writes elsewhere, that if we do not have a proper candidate for being the king or the leader of the Jewish people from the house of David HaMelech, descendant of David HaMelech, then it can be somebody else who is fitting, at least for a time, until a better candidate from a descendant of David HaMelech is found. If such a leader appears, if he follows the Torah, a person who lives in it and follows the Torah, according to the written and the oral Torah, and will direct and even force Am Yisrael to follow and to live up to the Torah. Such a person, such a leader, we can begin to assume that he is the Mashiach that was the Torah spoke of, that the Nevi'im spoke of. If this person succeeds in his policies and his leadership of the Jewish people and defeats the Jewish people's enemies, and is able to build the mikdash in its proper place, and on top of this, he ingathers the Jews from around the world. Such a person, we can then know for certain that he is the Melech HaMashiach that was discussed in the Tanakh, and particularly in the words of the Nevi'im, so frequently, so many times. And the Rambam writes, prior to these statements in Halacha, well, again I mark it out in blue, you should not imagine for a moment that the Mashiach that he has to perform miracles, or to change the order of the natural world, or to revive the dead, or anything of that sort, that fools say. There are plenty of Jews who say these things. Rambam knew this for a fact. Rambam writes about this in other places, that he's aware of all these people who say these things, Jews and also non-Jews perhaps. But he refers to such people as tipshim, fools, people who do not understand. This is not true, says Rambam. And we know this is not true for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is the following, that when Bar Kochva, whose name was Shimon ben Koziva HaMelech, the leader of the Jewish people, at the time of the revolt, the rebellion against the Romans, in the middle of the 2nd century, Rabbi Akiva supported his efforts and referred to him, and he said with regards to this person that he was the Mashiach. Rabbi Akiva thought he was, because at first he was very successful in his rebellion against the Romans. And he imagined, and many other Chachamim also believed, that he was the Melech HaMashiach, and the Jewish people would be victorious. In the end, it did not work out that way, but it was possible. Eventually, he was killed in battle, and the Jewish people suffered a great defeat. That is true. But what Rambam proves from all this is as follows. Once he was killed, it was apparent that he was not the Mashiach. وَلَا شَعْلُوا مِمَنُ حَخَمِيم لَا أُوتَ وَلَا وَفَيْتَ. But the Chachamim did not require or demand of him that he perform miracles. In other words, Rabbi Akiva's behavior and attitude towards Bar Kokhba proves that the Mashiach does not have to perform miracles. Bar Kokhba did not perform any miracles, and nevertheless he was considered a valid candidate, a legitimate candidate for the Melech HaMashiach, until it became apparent that this was not so. So how do all these things come to pass? It's all a function of what the Jewish people want. Where the Jewish people, as Rambam wrote here in Halachic, if a king arises, well, how does a king arise? A king doesn't arise by himself. A king, a leader, a political leader, this we're talking about the political leader of the Jewish people. A leader arises when there is a people, a nation, and there is a critical mass of people who want such a leader, who demand such a leader. And therefore they install him as their leader. If we're talking about a king, they coronate him. If it's a president, then they vote for him, whatever it is. But a person does not come to such a position of power until there is a people, a nation, that wishes such leadership. In other words, first you have to have a critical mass of Jews in Eretz Israel, and then they have to want to actually set their house in order, and they wish the Jewish people to get their act together, finally. And then they therefore begin to ask themselves, how do we establish a Torah-based government? And eventually, when that comes to pass, such a Torah-based government will, of course, wish to build a mikdash and wish to enable Jews to perform Korban Pesach. That is in fact how the Torah works. That is what Rambam is telling us here. And there is no halachic impediment, there is no halachic reason why we do not do these things today. It is only because of a kind of stupor in which the Jewish people found themselves, which is a hangover, kind of a hangover, as it were, as if we're drunk from the galut, like a person who has drunk much too much and passes out and eventually wakes up, but he has a hangover. So today, perhaps we have woken up after having passed out in the galut, so to speak. The galut is a kind of period where we are completely helpless, unable to do very much. But even having awoken from that state of affairs, we're no longer unconscious, but we are still suffering from this hangover, as if we are not required or not able to do these things. That is not true. And the sooner Am Yisrael understands and internalizes these basic fundamental facts, the better it will be for all of us, and the sooner all these things will become a reality. And it is our duty and our privilege in this generation and the coming generations to work towards that goal by raising awareness and teaching these things. I wish you all a Chag Sameach and a Shabbat Shalom. And I hope these words and these ideas that we have spoken about today will be taken to heart. And I definitely encourage all of you who are hearing this shiur now or in the future to look up all these sources for yourselves, become familiar and acquainted with them, so that you should have no doubt that anything that we have said here is untrue or has been misquoted or does not appear as it has been claimed. It is all there, it is all printed, it is all black and white. It's simply a matter of internalizing these basic Torah truths. Kol tov to everybody. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, Please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.